Hey guys, we're so close to hitting 100 subscribers, and I just wanted to take a moment to thank you all for the support so far. It means the world to me that you're here listening to these chilling, spine tingling stories. If you haven't yet, make sure to hit that subscribe button because there's so much more horror to come. Your support helps make this community even stronger, and I can't wait to share more terrifying tales with you. Stay tuned, stay scared, and don't forget to subscribe for more. Thanks again, and let's make this journey unforgettable. The house was quiet that first night, almost too quiet. I remember unpacking, trying to convince myself the creaks and groans of the old floorboards were nothing more than a century-old house settling in. I'd moved in just days after finalizing the deal. A steal, really, considering how much land came. The realtor had mentioned its charm, character, but even he had avoided meeting my eye when asked why the previous owners had left. The journals were hidden behind a loose panel in the living room wall. I wasn't even looking for anything, just trying to hang a picture, when the panel popped free, revealing a hollow space. Inside were 6 leather-bound books, each wrapped with string, their covers cracked and faded. The first journal had a name scrawled inside: Margaret Whitaker, 1927. Margaret's entries were plain at first, complaints about the harsh winters and endless chores of farm life. But as the weeks went on, the tone shifted. She wrote about hearing footsteps at night when she was alone, about finding tools moved or missing. Then, about the voices. At first, they were faint, coming from the edges of her hearing. Whispers she thought were the wind, but they grew louder, closer, until they seemed to come from the very walls themselves. I told myself it was just the rambling of an isolated woman, but something about her words lingered with me. I read through the night, unable to stop, even as a heavy unease settled in my chest. The final entry was short. They're always listening. I can't stay any. Margaret never mentioned what happened after that, but her journal ended abruptly, leaving the rest to my imagination. The next journal belonged to someone named Thomas Wren, dated 1943. His entries were equally mundane at first, describing his plans to renovate the house and expand the barn. But his tone, too, grew darker. Thomas spoke of shadows that moved on their own, of strange smells like rotting meat seeping from the floorboard. That night, I heard it for the first time. The whispering. I'd fallen asleep with one of the journals still in my lap when a faint murmur stirred me awake. At first, I thought it was the sound of the wind or the hum of an old pipe, but as I sat up, I realized it was neither. The sound was coming from the walls, low and indistinct, as though a crowd of people was murmuring just out of earshot. I pressed my ear against the plaster. The whispers stopped. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for them to return. They didn't. The next day, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me after reading the journals. But when I picked up Thomas's story again, I realized he'd described the exact same thing. Whispers that stopped the moment he tried to listen. His journal ended differently from Margaret. His last entry was a frantic scrawl. They want me to listen. They'll make me listen. I barely slept that night. Every sound the housemaid felt amplified, every creak of the floorboards like a footstep approaching my door. And then the whispers returned, louder this, clearer. "They know you're here," a voice hissed. I froze, clutching the blanket to my chest. I wanted to believe it was my imagination, but the whispers continued, growing louder until they were a cacophony of voices overlapping. They were angry, desperate. Some pleaded, others threatened. My heart pounded as I turned on every light in the house, hoping to chase away whatever was lurking in the darkness. But the voices didn't care about the light. They only stopped when I shouted for them to leave me alone. The next morning, I tore the journals from their hiding place and stuffed them into a box. I planned to burn them, to rid myself of whatever curse they carried. But as I stepped outside to the fire pit, I noticed something strange. Every window of the house reflected not just me, but dozens of shadowy figures behind me. I turned, expecting to see the house full of people, but it was empty. When I looked back at the windows, the figures were gone. My hands shook as I lit the match, dropping it onto the pile of leather and paper. The journals caught quickly, the flames consuming them in moments. For the first time in days, I felt a sense of relief. That night, the whisper, louder than ever, angrier. I could hear distinct words now. "You shouldn't have done that." The house groaned, the walls seeming to close in around me. Cracks formed in the plaster, spreading like veins. From those cracks seeped a dark, tar-like substance, dripping to the floor in thick globs. I screamed, running for the door, but it slammed shut in front of me. The whispers grew deafening, overlapping in a storm of voices that drowned out my own thoughts. "They're always listening," the voices said in unison. The last thing I remember is collapsing to the floor, the whispers filling my ears until there was nothing else. When I woke up, the house was silent again. The cracks were gone, the walls unblemished. But the journals, they were back in their hiding spot, untouched by fire, their leather covers pristine. I haven't dared open them again, but at night the whispers remind me they're still there, always listening. The locked room stood at the end of the upstairs hallway, its door painted a faded green, the brass handle tarnished with age. The realtor had brushed it off as a quirky feature of the house, claiming the key had been lost decades ago. I hadn't thought much of it at first. Every old house has its mysteries after all. But as the days passed, that door began to dominate my thoughts. It wasn't just the way it looked or the faint drafts that seemed to emanate from its edges. It was the feeling I got when I passed it, a weight pressing on my chest, a whisper in the back of my mind urging me to stay away. At night, the door seemed to change. The hallway would grow darker, the shadows pooling around that single locked portal. And then there were the sounds, scratches, and faint thuds, as if something on the other side was trying to get out. By the third night, I couldn't take it any. I had to know what was behind that door. I tried everything, picking the lock, shouldering it open, even calling a locksmith. Nothing worked. The locksmith, a wiry old man with tired eyes, left without charging me, muttering something about bad luck and things best left alone. The neighbor was no help either. She was polite enough when I introduced myself, but the moment I mentioned the locked room, her demeanor shifted. Her face turned pale, and she avoided my gaze. "You don't want to mess with that room," she said quietly. "No one's opened it for as long as I can remember. Just leave it be." Her words didn't deter me. They only made me more determined. I decided to try again then. Armed with a crowbar and a flashlight, I approached the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The hallway felt colder than usual, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. As I pressed the crowbar against the doorframe, a strange sensation washed over me, a mix of nausea and dizziness, as if the house itself resisting my effort. The crowbar slipped from my hands, clattering to the floor. At that moment, I heard it, a faint sobbing coming from the other side of the door. I froze. It was unmistakable, a child's cry, soft and muffled. My skin prickled as the sound grew louder, more insistent. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. "Is someone in there?" The sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so complete it felt oppressive. I stepped back, my courage faltering, and the feeling of being watched settled over me like a heavy cloak. I decided to sleep on it, or at least try to. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I dreamed of the door. In the dreams, it was open, revealing a room bathed in dim, flickering light. A figure stood in the corner, shrouded in shadow, its face obscured. When I woke, the door was different. The scratches I'd noticed before were deeper, angrier, as though something had clawed at the wood in desperation. And then there was the smell, a sickly sweet odor that made my stomach. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head. Maybe I was letting the house's age and atmosphere get to me. But then the door opened. It happened late at night, long after I'd given up trying to sleep. I was lying in bed when I heard it, the soft creak of hinges, slow and deliberate. My breath caught in my throat as I sat up, straining to listen. The sound of footsteps followed, faint but unmistakable. They moved down the hallway, stopping just outside my bedroom door. I didn't move, barely dared to breathe. The footsteps lingered, then receded, fading back toward the locked room. Summoning every ounce of courage, I grabbed my flashlight and crept into the hallway. The door was open. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring into the room. It was empty, or at least it should have been. Dust coated the floor, and cobwebs draped the corners, but the air felt alive, charged with a presence I couldn't see. At the center of the room was a small wooden rocking. It swayed gently, though there was no breeze to move it. I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath my weight. The smell was stronger here, almost unbearable. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment I thought I saw something. A faint outline of a figure standing by the window. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The flashlight went out completely, plunging me into darkness. The door slammed shut behind me, and I heard it lock with a loud click. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for the handle, yanking and twisting, but it wouldn't budge. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, and then the whispers began. They were faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from every direction. But as they grew louder, I realized they weren't whispers at all. They were voices, angry, pleading, accusing. "You shouldn't have opened it," they hissed. "You shouldn't be here." The rocking chair stopped moving, and the figure by the window grew clearer. It turned toward me, its face hidden in shadow, but its eyes burned like embers in the dark. I screamed, pounding on the door until my fists ached. The voices grew deafening, the figure advancing slowly. Just as I thought I would lose my mind, the door flew open, and I stumbled into the hallway. The room was empty again, the door closed tight. I didn't wait to see if it would open again. I packed my things and left the house that night, vowing never to return. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it, the faint creak of a rocking chair and the soft, pitiful sobbing of a child. It was supposed to be the perfect fresh start. After months of searching, I'd found the kind of deal that seemed too good to be true. A sprawling Victorian house nestled at the edge of a sleepy town. It was everything I'd dreamed of: high ceilings, intricate woodwork, and a backyard that led into a dense, mysterious forest. The neighbors were friendly, though distant, and the realtor had assured me the house's history was nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing out of the ordinary, except for the mirror. It hung in the main hallway, a tall, ornate frame that reached almost to the ceiling. Its glass was slightly warped, giving reflections a faintly distorted quality. The mirror wasn't included in the original listing. It had been left behind by the previous owners. Antique, the realtor had called it, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. At first, I didn't pay much attention. There was too much else to do. Boxes to unpack, walls to repaint, furniture to arrange. But as the days passed, I started to notice strange things. The air around the mirror was always cold, even when the rest of the house was warm. And sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw movement in the glass, just a flicker, like someone passing behind me. I told myself it was just my imagination, the product of stress and too many late nights. But the unease grew stronger. Every time I walked past the mirror, I felt as though it was watching me. One night, I decided to test it. Armed with a flashlight and a glass of wine for courage, I stood in front of the mirror, staring in its depth. My reflection stared back, warped and strange, the lines of my face twisting slightly at the edges. I leaned in closer, trying to make sense of the distortion, and that's when I saw it. Behind me in the reflection, something moved. I spun around, heart hammering, but the hallway was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the movement was gone. My reflection looked normal again, though my face was pale, my eyes wide with fear. The next few nights were worse. The dreams started. Vivid, unsettling dreams of a figure standing in the mirror, its face shrouded in shadow. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me, intensity that made my skin crawl. When I woke, the air in my bedroom felt heavy, and the mirror seemed to hum faintly, as though it were alive. One night, the dream changed. This time, the figure wasn't just in the mirror. It was in the room with me. I woke with a scream, drenched in sweat, and for a split second, I thought I saw the shadowy form at the foot of my bed. When I blinked, it was gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I decided to remove the mirror. It didn't belong in my house, not anymore. But when I tried to take it down, the screws holding it in place wouldn't budge. It was as if the mirror had fused to the wall, refusing to let go. Frustrated, I covered it with a sheet, hoping that would be enough to keep whatever was inside it at bay. It wasn't. The sheet didn't stay on for long. Every morning, I'd find it crumpled on the floor, as though someone or something had ripped it off during the night. And the reflections grew stranger. It wasn't just movement. Sometimes the hallway behind me looked different in the glass, darker, with shapes that didn't belong. One evening, as I was watching TV, the sound of glass shattering echoed through the house. I ran to the hallway, expecting to find the mirror broken, but it was intact. The glass was smooth, unblemished, but something was different. The reflection wasn't mine. Instead, I saw a woman in the mirror, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes wide with terror. She reached out, pressing her hands against the inside of the glass, her mouth moving soundlessly. I stumbled back, unable to tear my gaze away as she began to scream. A silent, agonized wail that seemed to shake the very air around. And then she disappeared. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room, every light in the house blazing, my thoughts racing. What was that thing in the mirror? Who was the woman? The answers came the next day, from an old man who lived down the street. I mentioned the mirror in passing, hoping for some explanation. His face darkened. That house, he said, his voice low, it's cursed. Been that way for as long as I can remember. People say the mirror holds the souls of those who've died there, trapped, waiting for someone to take their place. I laughed nervously, but his expression didn't change. Don't look too long, he warned, and whatever you do, don't let it see your fear. That night, I couldn't avoid it any longer. I stood before the mirror, my heart pounding, and demanded answers. What do you want from me? I shouted. Why are you here? The glass rippled, like water disturbed by a stone. My reflection twisted, contorted, until it wasn't me anymore. It was the woman again, her mouth forming words I couldn't hear. Slowly, the reflection raised its hand and pointed at me. The last thing I remember is the feeling of something pulling me, dragging me forward. My vision blurred, and the world around me seemed to dissolve. When I woke, everything was different. The house was silent, the mirror cold, still. But when I looked into the glass, I didn't see my reflection. I saw the hallway, empty except for a figure standing in front of the mirror. It wasn't me. When I first saw the house, I thought it was perfect. A charming two-story colonial with a wraparound porch and a sprawling backyard. It felt like the dream I'd been chasing for years. The price was suspiciously low, but the realtor brushed it off as motivated sellers. I didn't question it. I should have. The first night, I noticed the light in the attic. It flickered faintly, casting strange shadows across the ceiling of my bedroom. I assumed it was a wiring issue, a minor inconvenience in an otherwise beautiful home. But when I climbed the narrow staircase to the attic to investigate, the bulb was dead, the fixture dusty and unused. I shrugged it off and told myself it was just my imagination. But the next night, it happened again. This time, the flickering was accompanied by a faint creaking sound, as if someone were pacing directly above me. It wasn't until the third night that I realized the attic door was slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered shutting it after my initial visit, but there it was, just barely open, the dark space beyond it yawning like a mouth. I didn't sleep well after that. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence of the house, the groaning of old wood, the soft rustle of leaves against the windows, and, always, the faint creak of footsteps in the attic. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. I needed answers. Armed with a flashlight and a broom, I climbed the attic stairs. The air was cold and heavy, carrying a musty, earthy scent that made my skin crawl. Dust particles floated in the beam of my flashlight as I scanned the room, searching for the source of the sound. And then I saw it. In the far corner of the attic, partially obscured by old furniture and cobwebs, was a small wooden chest. Its surface was cracked and weathered, the metal hinges rusted with age. Something about it felt wrong, as though it didn't belong there. Against my better judgment, I opened. Inside were photographs, dozens, all black and white, their edges frayed. Each one depicted the same family, a man, a woman, and two children, standing stiffly in front of what appeared to be my house. Their faces were blurred, distorted, as though the film had been smudged before it developed. Beneath the photos were letters, handwritten notes on yellowed paper. Their ink faded but still legible. They were addressed to someone named Ellis, and each one begged for forgiveness. "We didn't mean for it to happen. Please let us go. We're sorry for what we did." The last note was different. The handwriting was jagged, the letters scrawled in frantic haste. "He's still here." I dropped the letter and stepped back, my heart pounding. The chest slammed shut on its own, the sound echoing in the confined space. The temperature in the attic plummeted, my breath clouding in front of me, and then I heard it, a low, guttural whisper. "Ellis!" I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The shadows in the attic seemed to shift, converging into a darker shape near the stairs. It stood motionless, humanoid but wrong, its edges flickering like static on an old TV. "Ellis," it whispered again, the voice cold and hollow. I stumbled down the stairs, slamming the attic door behind me. I shoved a chair under the handle, as though that would stop whatever was up there. For days, I avoided the attic, but the house wouldn't let me forget. The footsteps continued, heavier now, as if something was pacing angrily above me. The lights flickered constantly, plunging rooms into sudden, suffocating darkness. And then there were the voices, low, indistinct murmurs that grew louder whenever I was alone. One night, I woke to find the attic door wide open, the chair I'd wedged against it lying shattered on the floor. A cold wind blew down the staircase, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. I knew I couldn't stay. I packed a bag and headed for the door, but as I reached the threshold, the entire house seemed to groan. The walls trembled, the windows rattling violently in their frames. "You can't leave," the voice hissed, louder now, echoing through the empty halls. The floor beneath me felt unsteady, as though the house itself was trying to swallow me whole. I bolted, running out into the night without looking back. I never returned. A week later, I saw a news report about the house. The new owners, a young couple with a baby, had vanished without a trace. The neighbors reported hearing screams in the middle of the night, but by the time the police arrived, the house was empty. The attic door was wide open, the chest was gone. When I bought the house, it felt like fate. It was a charming, weathered bungalow nestled deep in the woods, the kind of place where you could escape the noise of the world. I wasn't looking for luxury. I wanted solitude, peace, and maybe a chance to start over. The realtor called it a fixer-upper with character. I should have known better. From the moment I moved in, something felt off. The house had a stillness about it, like it was holding its breath. The air was heavy, the kind of weight that made your shoulders ache. The first few nights were uneventful, but as the days passed, the oddities began to pile up. It started with the noises. At first, I thought it was the usual groans of an old house, wood settling, pipes rattling. But these sounds were different. They were deliberate. Late at night, I'd hear faint tapping coming from the walls, rhythmic and purposeful. It moved through the house, starting in the living room, passing through the kitchen, and ending at my bedroom door. One night, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I followed the noise as it echoed through the halls. It stopped as soon as I reached the living room. The room was dark, the only light coming from the pale glow of the moon filtering through the trees outside. That's when I saw it. A single handprint on the frosted window pane. It was small, like that of a child, but distorted, the fingers too long, the palm oddly shaped. My breath fogged the glass as I stared at it, trying to rationalize its presence. I scrubbed the window clean the next day, but the handprint returned that night. This time, there were two. The following morning, I found scratches on the back door, long, jagged marks that hadn't been there before. They looked like they'd been made by claws, and they dug deep into the wood. I considered calling someone, a locksmith, an exterminator, anyone, but I didn't. I was too stubborn, too determined to make the house work. Then, I found the basement. The door to the basement was hidden behind a bookcase in the living room, a detail the realtor had conveniently forgotten to mention. I discovered it by accident, trying to shove the case into place after moving some furniture. The hinges groaned as the door swung open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. I didn't want to go down there. Everything in me screamed to leave it alone, but curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my flashlight and took slow, hesitant steps into the gloom. The air grew colder as I descended, the smell of damp earth and mildew growing stronger. The basement was larger than I expected, with low ceilings, walls made of crumbling stone. In the center of the room was a wooden table, its surface scarred with deep gouges and strange symbols I couldn't decipher. And then there was the well. It sat in the far corner of the room, a crude stone structure with a rusted iron grate covering its mouth. The air around it felt wrong, colder than the rest of the basement, and I could hear faint whispers coming from its depths. I approached cautiously, shining my flashlight down into the darkness. The beam barely penetrated the void, revealing nothing but an endless blackness that seemed to swallow the light. That's when I heard it, a voice, faint and echoing, rising from the well. "Help me!" I froze. The voice was weak, trembling, but distinctly human. "Who's there?" I called, my voice shaking. "Please, help me!" Against my better judgment, I grabbed the iron grate and pulled. It groaned in protest, but eventually gave way, the rusted hinges snapping under the strain. I leaned over the edge, peering into the abyss, and then I saw them, two pale hands reaching up from the darkness, clawing at the stone walls of the well. I stumbled back, my heart pounding as the figure began to emerge. It was humanoid, but wrong. Its proportions twisted and grotesque. The skin was ashen and stretched too tightly over its frame, the eyes sunk in pits of blackness. "Thank you," its voice a sickly mockery of gratitude. I ran. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. But the house wasn't the same. The air felt heavier, oppressive, and the tapping on the walls grew louder, more insistent. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room with every light on, clutching a kitchen knife, like it could protect me from whatever I'd unleashed. The noises didn't stop, and neither did the whisper. The next morning, I packed my things and left the house. I didn't bother locking them. I didn't want to risk going near the basement again. I stayed with a friend for a few days, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But then the dreams started. In everyone, I was back in the house, standing at the edge of the well. The whispers grew louder, the voices multiplying, calling my name. Last night, I woke to find dirt under my fingernail and scratches on my arms. The same handprints from the window now stain the mirror in my apartment. I don't think I escaped. The house may be miles away, but it's still with me, and I can hear the tapping, growing louder every night. I never believed in curses, haunted houses. I was a skeptic, the type to roll my eyes at ghost stories and laugh off superstition. So when I bought the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town, I didn't bat an eye at the warnings from the local. They called it the Hollow House and spoke of strange happenings, disappearances, accidents, and shadows that moved on their own. To me, it was all nonsense. The house was beautiful in its own decrepit way. Weathered wood, sagging porches, and vines crawling up the sides gave it a gothic charm. It sat on a sprawling piece of land surrounded by dense woods that seemed to stretch endlessly. It was exactly what I needed. Quiet, isolated, and cheap. The first night was uneventful, though the silence was unnerving. The house had a way of amplifying even the smallest sound, creaks, groans, and the faint whisper of wind through the cracks. I chalked it up to the age of the house and told myself I'd get used to it. But on the second night, I woke to the sound of footsteps. They were faint at first, soft and deliberate, moving through the hallway outside my bedroom. I froze, my heart pounding as I strained to listen. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment the house was silent again. Then came the knock. 3 sharp, deliberate raps on my bedroom door. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation. Maybe it was an animal, or perhaps the old wood settling in a peculiar way. But deep down, I knew neither of those explanations made sense. The knock came again, louder this time. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under my bed and crept toward the door. My hand trembled as I turned the knob and flung the door open. The hallway was empty, bathed in the pale light of the moon filtering through the window. I checked every room in the house, every closet, every shadowed corner. There was nothing. The following days were a blur of strange occurrences. Lights flickered despite new bulbs. Doors I knew I'd closed were left open. And always, there was the feeling of being watched, a heavy, oppressive presence that seemed to linger just out of sight. One afternoon, as I was unpacking in the living room, I found something strange beneath a loose floorboard. It was a bundle of old photographs, faded and brittle with age. They depicted a family, a man, a woman, and 2 young boys, standing in front of my house. They didn't smile, their expressions blank and lifeless. On the back of one photo was a date, June 3rd, 1947. Curious, I searched the property records at the local library. What I found sent a chill down my spine. The family in the photo had lived in the house decades ago. On June 3rd, 1947, all four of them vanished without a trace. That night, the knocking returned. This time, it wasn't just at my bedroom. It came from all around the house, on the walls, the windows, the floor beneath my bed. It was relentless, a cacophony of sound that made it impossible to think. I shouted at whatever was causing, demanding it stop, and it did. For a moment, the silence was almost worse. Then came the whisper. It was fainter, just a soft, hissing sound that grew louder and more distinct. "Get out!" it said, the voice low and guttural, filled with malice. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, gripping the bat like a lifeline. The whispers continued, echoing through the house, growing more insistent with each passing hour. By morning, I'd had enough. I packed a bag, determined to leave, but as I stepped outside, the world felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy with an unnatural stillness. The woods seemed closer than before, their shadows longer and darker. I made it as far as my car before I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. It was tall and thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, but I felt its gaze, cold and piercing. I fumbled with my keys, but the engine wouldn't start. The figure began to move, its jerky, unnatural steps bringing it closer. Panicking, I ran back into the house and locked the door. The knocking returned almost immediately, louder than ever, shaking the walls. Desperate, I shouted, "What do you want from me?" The knocking stopped, and the whispering returned, louder and clearer than before. "This is our home," it said, "and now, so are you." The last thing I remember is the sound of splintering wood as the door burst open. When I woke, it was morning. The house was silent, the air heavy with an eerie calm. I tried to leave again, but the car still wouldn't start, and the figure was back, watching from the woods. I've been here for weeks now, unable to leave. The house won't let me go, and the whispers grow louder every. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. This isn't just a house, it's a trap, and now it has me. When I first saw the house, I almost didn't go inside. It was a squat gray structure at the end of a dead-end street, surrounded by a skeletal fence and a yard of overgrown weeds. Something about it felt inherently wrong, like the shadows cast by its cracked windows were deeper than they should have been. But I needed a place to stay, and the price was too good to ignore. The landlord, a wiry man with sunken eyes, handed me the keys without much conversation. "Just don't go into the basement," he muttered, almost as an afterthought. I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking. He wasn't. The first few days were uneventful. I spent most of my time unpacking, ignoring the occasional creaks and groans of the house. But by the third night, I started to notice things. It began with the cold. No matter how high I set the thermostat, the air inside the house always felt frigid, especially near the floorboard. And then there was the smell, faint but persistent, like damp earth and rotting wood. The noises started on the fourth night. At first they were faint, a soft tapping, almost like rain against the windows. But there was no rain. As the night went on, the sounds grew louder and more distinct, scratching, dragging, and then the unmistakable sound of something heavy being moved across the floor below me. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to check the basement. I couldn't shake the feeling that the noises were coming from there. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, I pried open the door that had been nailed shut and descended the narrow staircase. The basement was pitch black and colder than the rest of the house. My flashlight flickered as I scanned the room, revealing cracked cement walls and a dirt floor. The smell was stronger here, a cloying mix of mildew and decay that made my stomach churn. In the corner, partially buried in the dirt, was an old wooden chest. It was covered in strange symbols, carved deeply into the wood. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside were objects that didn't make sense together. A child's shoe, a rusted knife, a doll missing its eyes, and what looked like a bundle of hair tied with a red ribbon. My hands trembled as I lifted the hair, revealing a photograph beneath it. The photo was black and white, depicting a family standing in front of the house. A man, a woman, and a young girl. The girl's face was scratched out, deep gouges running through the paper. That's when I heard the whisper. "Why are you here?" The voice was soft, almost a breath, but it came from right behind me. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my grip. The basement was empty. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. That night, the noises intensified. The scratching was louder, more frantic, as if something was trying to claw its way out. The dragging sounds moved through the house, echoing in the empty rooms, and then there were the whispers. They came from everywhere and nowhere, overlapping voices speaking a language stand. But one phrase stood out, repeated over and over. "She's still here." The next morning, I found footprints of dirt outside the basement door. They were small, like those of a child, but the steps were too far apart, almost as if she had been leaping across the ground. I tried to leave, but my car wouldn't start. My phone wouldn't charge. Even the lights in the house began to flicker, plunging me into darkness for long stretches of time. That night, I saw her. I woke to the sound of my bedroom door creaking open. The room was bathed in faint moonlight, and at the foot of my bed stood a little girl. Her dress was tattered, her skin pale and translucent. Her eyes were empty sockets, black and endless. "Why won't you help me?" she whispered. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. She took a step closer, her movements jerky and unnatural. "They took me," she said, her voice breaking. "They'll take you too." The room went black. When I woke, it was morning, and she was gone. But the footprints remained. Small, muddy prints leading from my bed to the basement door. I haven't gone back into the basement since. The noises haven't stopped, and neither have the whispers. Every night I hear her voice, pleading and accusing all at once. I'm trapped here, just like she is. And I know it's only a matter of time before I join her. The house was a mistake. I knew it the moment I stepped inside, but by then it was too late to turn back. I had signed the papers, shaken hands with the agent, and transferred my savings. It wasn't the house's appearance that unnerved me, it was the feeling. The air was dense, heavy, and the silence was oppressive. It felt like the walls were watching, listening. I moved in on a crisp autumn morning. The neighborhood was quiet, almost unnatural, with rows of similar houses standing like forgotten sentinels. My house was different. The windows seemed darker, the shadows deeper, and the faint smell of something sour lingered in the air. The first night, I woke to the sound of whispers. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. I lay in bed straining to hear, but they faded before I could make out any words. I told myself it was just the wind, my imagination playing tricks on me. But the whispers returned the next night. They were louder this time, coming from somewhere deep in the house. I got up and wandered through the dark halls, clutching a flashlight. The beam swept across the empty rooms, revealing nothing but old furniture and peeling wallpaper. Still, the whispers persisted, growing louder as I approached the basement door. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, and a chill ran down my spine. I turned away, convincing myself it wasn't worth investigating in the middle of the night. The following days brought more disturbance. Objects moved on their own, subtle shifts at first, like a chair slightly out of place or a cupboard left open. Then it became more blatant. I'd leave a room and return to find everything rearranged. Once, I came home from the store to find all the furniture piled in the center of the living room. The worst part was the mirrors. Every mirror in the house began to distort my reflection. At first, it was subtle. My face seemed stretched or blurred, but only for a second. Then, it became more pronounced. One morning, I glanced at the bathroom mirror and saw myself standing behind me. My reflection grinned, its teeth sharp and unnaturally white, while I froze in terror. When I turned around, nothing was. That's when I started to dream about the house. In my dreams, it wasn't empty. Shadows moved in the corners, and the whispers were louder, overlapping, and chaotic. One voice always stood out, though, a deep, guttural growl that spoke a single word: mine. I became obsessed with the basement. Something was drawing me, an insidious pull I couldn't ignore. During the day, I'd sit by the door, listening for any sound. At night, I dreamt of descending its stairs, the darkness swallowing me whole. One evening, I couldn't resist any longer. Armed with a flashlight and a crowbar, I pried open the basement door. The hinges screamed, and a rush of cold air greeted me. The stairs creaked beneath my weight as I descended, the flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the stone walls. The basement was vast, far larger than I'd expected. The air was damp and smelled of rot. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. At the center of the room was a large, circular sigil carved into the floor. It was intricate and menacing, filled with symbols I didn't recognize. And in the middle of the sigil lay a small wooden box. I approached it cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. The box was old, its surface etched with the same symbols as the sigil. It was warm to the touch, pulsing faintly as though it were alive. Against my better judgment, I opened it. Inside was a single withered heart, blackened and shriveled. As soon as the box was opened, the whispers erupted into a deafening roar. The walls trembled, and the sigil began to glow a deep blood red. The air grew thick, almost unbreathable, and I felt something cold and wet brush against my ankle. I shone the flashlight down and saw a dark, viscous liquid seeping from the walls, pooling at my feet. Then I heard it, the growl. "You shouldn't have opened it." The voice was everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the basement. The liquid began to rise, pulling at my legs, dragging me toward the sigil. I tried to run, but my feet wouldn't move. A shape emerged from the darkness, a figure tall and hunched, its body a twisted mass of shadow and sinew. It had no face, but its presence was suffocating. "You belong to me now," it growled, its voice reverberating in my chest. I don't remember how I escaped. One moment I was in the basement, drowning in darkness. The next I was on the front lawn, gasping for air. The house was silent again, its windows dark and empty. I left that night, abandoning everything I owned. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. But the house won't let me go. Every night, I dream of the sigil, the box, the whispers, and every morning I wake with the faint smell of rot in my nose and the feeling of cold, wet hands gripping my ankles. The house isn't finished with, and I don't think it ever will be. The house I moved into had always been abandoned. It stood on the outskirts of town, cloaked in overgrown ivy and the remnants of time long past. The locals avoided it, whispering stories about the previous owners, a family that had vanished without a trace. The house had remained empty for decades, and no one had dared to live there since. But when I stumbled upon it one rainy evening, I couldn't resist. It was cheap, it was secluded, and I needed a fresh start. The real estate agent barely said a word when he handed me the keys. "It's been empty for a while," he mumbled, "but it's solid. A good place to get away from it all." I should have known something was wrong. I should have listened to the warnings, but I didn't. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking, settling in. The house was large, with high ceilings, dusty furniture covered in white sheets. The floors creaked beneath my feet, and the walls groaned with the weight of years of neglect. There was something almost comforting about it, a quiet solitude that I hadn't realized I craved. But on the fourth night, things started to change. I woke to the sound of footsteps, not the creaking of the house settling, but distinct, heavy footsteps, moving through the dark halls just outside my bedroom door. My heart raced as I lay perfectly still, hoping it was just my imagination. But the footsteps grew closer, stopping just outside my door. I waited, breathless, but there was nothing. No knock, no voice, just silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I scoured the house, convinced I'd find some rational explanation. The doors were locked, the windows shut. There was no one else in the house, but the air felt thick, heavy, as though something had been waiting for me. That evening, the footsteps returned. This time, I wasn't as brave. I crept down the hall, flashlight in hand, my pulse pounding in my ears. The footsteps seemed to lead me toward the basement, the only part of the house I hadn't explored. The basement door was old, the wood splintered and cracked, but it didn't stop me. I pushed it open, the hinges squealing in protest. The stairs descended into darkness, the air colder the further I went down. At the bottom, the flashlight illuminated something strange, an old rocking chair. It sat alone in the middle of the room, its wooden frame warped with age. The chair creaked, as though someone had just gotten up from it, but I was alone. As I approached, the temperature dropped even further, and the shadows seemed to shift. That's when I noticed the floor. There were fresh footprints, wet and muddy, leading in a circle around the chair. The prints were small, like a child, but the mud was black, as though it had come from some deep, hidden place. Before I could think, the door slammed shut behind me, locking me inside. My breath caught in my throat as I turned to face the rocking chair, and then I heard it, a soft, childlike giggle. It was coming from the chair. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The giggle grew louder, more frantic. The chair began to rock on its own, creaking and groaning, as though someone, or something, was sitting in it. The giggling turned to sobs, low and guttural, filled with pain. I tried the door again, but it wouldn't budge. My pulse was racing as I backed away from the chair, my eyes glued to it. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward me, like dark fingers trying to grasp at my legs. Then, from the darkness, I saw her, a little girl standing in the corner of the room. Her hair hung in tangled knots around her face, and her eyes were wide, hollow black pits. She wore a tattered nightgown, its hem stained with something dark. She stepped forward, her bare feet making no sound on the concrete floor. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice soft and cruel. The room grew colder. The chair's rocking grew faster, more violent, and the shadows seemed to close in around me. I screamed, my voice echoing off the walls, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. The girl smiled, her mouth stretching too wide, showing sharp, jagged teeth. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. The chair stopped rocking, the shadows receded. The air returned to its normal, cold chill. The door opened. I didn't think. I ran. I bolted upstairs and locked myself in the bedroom, my heart racing, my mind spinning. I couldn't make sense of what had just happened. Had it been a hallucination? Was I losing my mind? The house remained silent after that. The footsteps stopped. The whispers faded. But I could feel it. The presence in the walls. The cold weight of something watching me. I tried to leave the next morning, but the car wouldn't start. The phone lines were down. I was trapped. And that's when the scratching started. It began at the door, like nails dragging across the wood. But then it spread. Across the walls, the floors, the ceiling. The sound was maddening, relentless, like something was trying to get in. I could hear the little girl's voice again, soft and mocking. "You'll never leave." And she was right, because when I looked out the window, the town was gone. The street was empty. The houses vanished into mist. There was only the house, standing alone in a sea of nothing. I am still here. The walls are closing in. The scratching never stops. The girl's whispers are all I hear. And I know deep down that I'll never escape. It was supposed to be the perfect house. After years of renting cramped apartments and moving from place to place, I finally found it. A large, old Victorian house tucked away on the outskirts of town. The kind of place that looked like it came straight out of a forgotten era. The price was unbelievably low, and the real estate agent practically begged me to take it. The house has been on the market for years, she said with a strained smile, and we're just eager to sell. You'll love it, trust me. I should have been suspicious, but the allure of the spacious rooms, the high ceilings, the sprawling yard, it all seemed too good to be true. The moment I stepped inside, I felt something shift. The air was thick, heavy with age and dust, but it was also alive in a way that I couldn't quite explain. There was a weight to the silence, an unnatural stillness that wrapped itself around me. The first few days were fine. The house was a bit more worn than I'd anticipated. Faded wallpaper, creaky floors, and old furniture left behind by the previous owner. But nothing that couldn't be fixed with a little time and effort. I spent hours cleaning, organizing, making the space my own. Then, on the fifth night, it happened. I woke up in the middle of the night, the sound of footsteps echoing through the house. Heavy, deliberate steps, as if someone was walking slowly across the floor. I held my breath listening, but the house was quiet again. Too quiet. I dismissed it, telling myself it was just the house settling or maybe the wind outside, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next night, the footsteps returned, but this time, they were closer, moving through the hallway outside my room, just beyond the door. I grabbed the flashlight by my bedside and quietly crept to the door, my heart hammering in my chest. There was no one. The hallway was empty, still and silent. But when I turned back to the room, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the faint light from the flashlight, there was a shadow in the corner of the room, just a shape, a dark figure standing still. I didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe. The figure didn't shift, didn't make a sound. It was as though it was watching me, waiting. I ran out of the room and into the hallway, but the shadow followed. It moved with me, its presence always just out of my peripheral vision, never directly in front of me, but always there. The next few days passed in a blur of tension. The footsteps continued every night, always closer, always louder. The shadow remained, shifting in the corners of rooms and hallways, never fully revealing itself. And then came the whisper. At first, they were faint, like voices on the edge of my hearing. I would hear a word or two, but they would fade as quickly as they came. But then they grew louder, clearer, too clear. The whispers were coming from the walls. I pressed my ear to the plaster one night, straining to hear. The voice was low and raspy, filled with malice. You shouldn't have come. The words sent a chill down my spine, and I recoiled from the wall. The temperature in the room dropped, and I could see my breath clouding in the air. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. Leave! I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to find out what was happening. I made my way down to the basement, a place I had avoided since moving in. The basement door creaked open, and the stale, cold air rushed up to greet me. The light bulb flickered weakly, casting long, twitching shadows on the walls. The basement was cluttered, filled with old boxes and forgotten relics of the past. But it was the far corner of the room that caught my attention. A small wooden door, half hidden behind a stack of dusty crates. The door had no handle, just a rusted keyhole. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. I couldn't resist. I forced the door open with my hands, the wood groaning in protest. Inside, I found a small room, dimly lit by the flickering light from above. And in the center of the room, there was an object I will never forget. It was a mirror, old, tarnished, and cracked down the middle. But as I stepped closer, I could see something in the reflection. A figure standing just behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart raced as I turned back to the mirror, my reflection no longer my own. The face staring back at me was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. The reflection didn't move with me. It stayed still, grinning. It's mine. The whisper echoed through my mind, and I felt something cold and sharp press against my chest, as though invisible hands were reaching into me. I screamed and stumbled backward, knocking over a crate in the process. The mirror shattered. As the glass hit the floor, the room went black. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. But when I looked around, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The mirror was in my room, leaning against the wall, whole and undisturbed, and the face in the reflection was still smiling. I tried to leave the house the next morning, but my car wouldn't start. My phone was dead, the lines cut off. It was as if the house itself was holding me prisoner. The footsteps are back now, louder than ever. The whispers never stop. And the mirror? It's always there, watching, waiting. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. The house is alive, and it wants me. It always has. And no matter what I do, no matter where I go, I can't escape. It's only a matter of time before the house claims me completely.